Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by Swithun Dobson to discuss the sort of nature of interpreting history and what can be learned from history. So, yeah, why don't you sort of explain to the viewers, Swithun, where this sort of dispute is coming from?
Okay, so if any of you have watched Todd's stuff for a while, a lot of his complaints about various political ideologies, particularly libertarians and the left in general, is that they don't know history. And because they don't know history, they have various blind spots in their sort of political philosophy, which leads them to lots and lots of different errors, which could be avoided if you knew history. So the question arises, though, what can you actually learn from history? Now, you might think, well, of course you can learn things from history. I mean, everyone says, if you, the only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. So there's the idea that, we can and should learn from history. But it's not as nearly as straightforward as that. And if you're familiar with works by, say, Mises or Hans Hopper, this comes to light. So let's, for example, give an economics-related example, which will make the point clear. Let's suppose in 2010 that the federal government increased the minimum wage. And let's then see after that event that the number of people employed went up. Well, does it follow from the fact that the minimum wage went up that caused the increase in employment? Well, we don't know, or at least not just from that data, because we don't know whether the employment went up because of, in spite of, or independent of the increase in the minimum wage. A different example would be mask mandates, for example. Positive tests go, well, what happened with the mask mandates is ever since they introduced them, the infection rates as recorded, at least in England, have gone up. Now, does that mean that masks cause coronavirus infections to increase? Well, it's not obvious as to whether that's the case or not. And many of the pro-mask brigade would go very upset if you suggested that could happen, despite them using the complete opposite logic when it comes to lockdowns, whether lockdowns work on. And it's like, we introduced it and then deaths went down. Again, the problem is, did it happen because of or in spite of it? So in history in general, we can say, we may make a claim that decentralized governments are unstable. James Lawrence points to the Polish Republic of the 18th, I think it's between like the 16th and the early 18th century, which had a very weak central king who was elected by the aristocrats, and then they were sort of conquered by the Prussians, I think, if I remember correctly, or invaded by the Russians as well. I'm not sure. As ever, Poland was a bit of a playground between the Russians and the Germans. But the question arises, why did they lose? Did they lose because of their political structure or in spite of it? If they'd done something else, would they have ended up being worse off? Would they have been conquered earlier if they'd had a more centralized structure? Would that have actually retarded wealth generation, which would have meant that they would have had less good weaponry, etc., with which they would have been able to defend themselves? So it's not obvious as to what history can directly teach us. Back to Hans Hopper as another example here would be his points about absolute monarchy, that they were less interventionist than current democratic states in the West, at least in the 20th century and 21st. Again, is that because they were absolute monarchies that they did that, or in spite of it? Now, Hopper has a theory to do this, a theory about time preference and the incentives involved, which he uses to interpret the history. Now, whether that's good history or not is another question. Whether he's right is another question, but at least he has sort of a theory to kind of interpret it. And to circle back, I mentioned Mises earlier. Mises is quite explicit about this when it comes to his economics, is that whenever we look at history, we have to use theory to interpret history. Because we need a theory first before we can we know what kind of evidence to go and look for to even do history. So you need some sort of at least some framework beforehand to go and investigate it. So hopefully this gives a decent idea as to where the idea for this discussion came from and where I think it could go. So my question to Todd is, what can we actually learn from history? And can history stand alone away from, say, economics, psychology, and sociology, something like that? Can it stand alone as its own unique discipline? And can we do theory-free history? And in what way does theory relate to history? Now, that was a lot of stuff. Hit it whatever you want.
Yeah, okay. So let's start off with sort of, I think, the best summation of my complaint. This comes from the conservative historian Paul Johnson. The study of history is a powerful antidote to contemporary arrogance. It is humbling to discover how many of our glib assumptions, which seem to us novel and plausible, have been tested before, not once, but many times, and in innumerable guises, and discovered to be at great human cost wholly false. So let me give a couple of concrete examples of what I've complained about to then sort of give us something to attach our minds to. So one would be if we look at, say, Keith Preston. Now, of course, he's not ignorant of history, but his case is that from an anarchist point of view, it behooves them to reach across ideological lines for other anti-authoritarians, like maybe militia types, maybe even lumpen proles like gangsters. But what'll happen is the more ideologically oriented anarchists will be like, no. We have to ally with Trotskyists and tankies and left liberals because we all want the same thing, don't we? And after three periods in history, one in the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920, and then the Russian Revolution of 1917 to 1921, and then the Spanish Civil War, where anarchists have been operating under that assumption. 3 times, different countries that had exactly the same results. The Trotskyists, the Stalinists, the left liberals betrayed them and exterminated them. And we see now that with the faux anarchists of today, they're more than willing to march with Maoists, Trotskyists, and Stalinists. And it's like, well, okay, you know what they say, fool me once, fool me twice. But, how many times do the anarchists have to go through this before they realize, hey, this maybe is a bad idea? Because these aren't identically the same people, but these are people that share the same worldview, that share the same attitudes throughout history. The sort of state socialists and their iterations, the left liberals and their iterations, and the anarchists and their iterations. And I think this is a problem that someone like Keith Preston is running into. He's trying to apply historical analysis here, and other anarchists just aren't willing to go there. See, their ideology blinds them to learning from history. They can't learn from the fact that Stalinists and state socialists have always betrayed them. Always. They think that, no, this time it'll be different. But they have no reason to. The only reason why they would have to think next time would be different is because of an ideological commitment, not a commitment based in observed realities. So that's one example. I guess from the way I might put a concrete example for the libertarian is their argument is ceteris paribus, the private production of any good or service is superior to the state production of it. And then they also assume that all services are fungible in the sense that a private service like, say, DoorDash delivering food to your house is the same as providing security. That has, I don't think, been adequately demonstrated, but for the sake of argument, let's just say that on that spectrum, they're all services that are roughly fungible in nature. And that a private force is going to be a private production is going to be a more efficient way to produce it. And they made these claims in the 1970s when it came to consumer goods in the Soviet Union. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the bread shortages and everything else, it was a very strong indication of the correctness of the libertarian analysis. But the point that I'm arguing is that in the same way that they predicted correctly the collapse of Soviet economic production, we don't see any sort of similar collapse of state provision of defense. And furthermore, we don't see historically, with a few exceptions, too many examples of large-scale private production of defense. And so one would expect that if these are on a continuum, then the same trends that led to the privatization of the USSR's and Eastern Europe's economy would lead to the privatization of capital D defense or national defense, which we don't really see happening. And then the question is, well, why is that? I mean, is it because they're maybe not fungible goods at all and it's the analysis is misapplied? Possibly. But that's sort of where I'm coming from. So if we look at history as a discipline, I mean, obviously, if we look, it's today often considered a social science, and social sciences would include history, sociology, psychology, but none of these are truly sciences in the sense of physics, biology, or chemistry, where you have observable, repeatable experiments, tests and controls. There are no tests and controls for history in an absolute sense. What we can do is we can get a relative test and control. So, for example, East-West Germany, North-South Korea, we could argue that East and West Germany are test and control for, well, what if Germans were communists and what if Germans were free market? They're both Germans. They both are very similar in a lot of ways, except they have different economic models imposed on them. And I've often seen libertarians appeal to North and South Korea and East and West Germany in a fashion like that. Because the argument is, well, Rothbard and Mises might say these things, and they have written these things. Rothbard is also known for writing a lot of history. So at best, it's redundant. Why even bother doing it? I think because Rothbard intuitively knows that you have to have a sufficient body of at least points of contact between the theory and history. And if there are too many points of contact that are lost, then you run into trouble. And of course, I would agree with the libertarian critique of socialism in the sense that they make theoretical claims, but the points of contact with history become extremely tenuous. So, for example, the idea that socialism could work again if we just gave it another try. Well, it's like we already tried it in a lot of different ways in a lot of different places in the 20th century. It's difficult to imagine what the left would do today differently, such that it could avoid all of the historical failures of socialism in the 20th century. And that's often the claim that you'll hear even from Austrians. At least when I was familiar with the group, you hear a lot of that, like, well, you've already tried it. The historical accounts are clear. Now, often you would also hear the a priori argument, which is true, but it's never just that. And the argument, the danger of just being purely theory is that it becomes totally detached from real experience. So again, looking at the socialists, Lenin was both a theoretician and a pragmatist, and he criticized a lot of the Western Marxists for just being pure theory, like the Social Democrats of Germany and the cultural Marxists of the West. And so what we end up having is that Lenin actually produced a socialist society. As of yet, these people have not. And I think one of the reasons why Lenin achieved where they failed is because he was pragmatic and up to a point. Obviously, the Soviet Union still failed, and more in a way that he wasn't. And so the other Marxists of the Western Hemisphere were not. And probably, I think, what can we learn from history? How can we learn from it? I think an instructive example would be the Federalist Papers of the 1780s when the U.S. Constitution was being drafted. So if somebody had told you in, say 1760, we should try republics and democracies again, and they'd say, oh, well, you're crazy. That all ended in the classical age. And then we got the Roman Empire, and since then we've had monarchies. Clearly, democracies and republics don't work. Now that's, of course, then in a mere 20 years, you have a republic in North America. But that would be a bad way of reading history to use it to make a point. But if you look at, say, how the Federalist Papers were done, is they looked at various republics throughout history, why they were successful, why they ultimately failed, and tried to develop an interpretive model from that, such that they could hedge against many of these externalities. So maybe another way to put it would be, if we look at, say, Aristotle and Machiavelli, they look at the historical record and then they try to synthesize an interpretation that can best explain those known facts. Whereas what I would argue libertarians and socialists, and to some extent even the alt-right does, is they have a theory that they impose onto the historical data, which then precludes things from the historical store that just doesn't get accounted for, doesn't get explained. And a lot of the reasons why these highly ideological systems fail is because their own ideological blinders prevent them from seeing things that might otherwise be seen and taken into account and hedged against in a way that, say, the Founding Fathers and the Federalist Papers did. So again, that's trying to answer all the different points you made, so you can pick up where you feel like is the most interesting.
Okay, so yes, it is true that libertarians, for example, will point to East and West Germany, and I think I would agree that those are quite good. That they are quite good historical test cases of comparative systems, but there seem to be relatively few and far between like that. Same with North and South Korea. However, on their own, they don't really prove anything. It was interesting, the Richard Wolff, David Friedman debate. David Friedman made the classic argument against East Germany. But then Richard Wolff was saying, well, yeah, but you can't really blame East Germany for its relative economic backwardness, because it was economically backward even before it was split into East and West. It was much more heavily agricultural, and it wasn't as heavily industrial, and so you can't expect it to have been as developed as the West. Now, you could then look at comparative growth rates. You could do lots of other things. But the problem with just looking at East and West Germany, you could always think of a factor which can explain why it doesn't prove what the other side actually claims it proves. And this is my problem with just trying to look at the history. Is you never know which variables that are there, which are causing a certain thing to play out in the way that it does. So, for example, even the Soviet Union and other sort of socialist systems, you could always point to, and as they always do, there were bad actors which made it fail. And in principle, I don't see why that couldn't explain it. But the reason I think it ultimately does fail is for theoretical reasons, which explains why it fell. I'm not sure if you're object to all theorizing per se, but I just don't see how you can avoid the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy if you just do history as, well, we'll just look what happened, and then we'll learn from it immediately. I'm not sure how you envisage history proper and the appropriate relationship with theory. I mean, you cited the Federalist Papers. What is it about the Federalist Papers methodology which you think is appropriate to be able to learn from history? What are the sort of principles that you would apply for learning from history, and how would you defend those principles, except with reference to sort of theoretical virtues that those principles may have?
Yeah, sure. So let's start with this. I think you were getting it to at an important point, which I will get back to in a moment, where you said, is it maybe it's not so much that I'm objecting to theory as such, but the particular use of theory or where you begin with in the process. So let's sort of start from how I'm looking at it as a more of a bottom-up enterprise than a top-down theoretical enterprise that we see with a lot of modern ideologies. So when we look at a historical event or factor or sequence of events, there are principles and rules of textual verification, which are used to determine, okay, Is this an authentic document? Okay, check. Okay, now if it's an authentic document, the person writing it, is he a trustworthy source? And then there's all these principles that you can appeal to. There's the principle of embarrassment. Does this guy admit something about his own side that's not very flattering? Does he say something positive about the other side? That would indicate that, well, okay, maybe this piece of evidence is more likely to be true than say if he was flattering his own side and condemning the enemy. Now, even if we do find a source that does that, flatters one's own side and condemns the enemy, that doesn't necessarily render it inaccurate. It renders it possibly inaccurate in some sense. And so, but once we've developed a general body of what we might call lowercase f facts, history doesn't have facts like mathematics or philosophy, where you have deductive axioms, but in the sense that we might have a fact in chemistry. It's something that has been verified under a certain set of non-a priori conditions, under some set of a posteriori conditions, that such, we'll assume it to be true for normal maintenance of what we're doing. And once we have a sufficient body of this, where it's like we more or less know that Caesar crossed the Rubicon, we more or less know that Columbus discovered the New World. I mean, these are things that nobody seriously doubts happened. They just question various aspects about it or the implications of it. Okay, so then once we have that body built up, then we try to say, okay, well, what are common themes and trends and factors in these bodies of facts? What can we learn from them such that we can tie it together in some sort of, dare I say it, theory? But the theory that's derived is a theory that is being informed by historical data points, if you will, rather than having a theory that's crafted independent of these historical data points and then superimposed on them. Because what then ends up happening is these theories that are formulated that way end up just ignoring out of hand large segments of things that are historically valid accounts of what happened that have a bearing on their own philosophy. And so the problem then is they are perpetually unable to see it because they just refuse to look at the grassroots level of where this contextualization of history is coming from. Whereas if we start at using the methodology of historical inquiry, and then we can determine which events are likely to have happened, which maybe happened, maybe didn't, and which were total myth, totally fabricated. Starting from that and then building a theory up from there, trying to tie together pieces. That is what I would prefer to see. And that is what I see happening with, say, something like the Federalist Papers. Another good example would be Aristotle and the Politics. So he has a very sort of anthropological approach where he looks at all these different peoples around the world, contemporary with himself, seeing how they do things. He's, of course, referring to earlier historical events. And then he's trying to build a particular political theory and political economy around that. And in one sense, we see the enduring quality of it because the Aristotelian political and economic theory has had a tremendous amount of influence, throughout Western history, even if parts of it have been deemed to be flawed due to Aristotle's limited perspective at the time. And we can also see that, for example, the collapse of socialism in the 1990s in part was exacerbated and accelerated by various factors they refused to even consider because their philosophy and ideology failed to even account for their existence. Whereas in theory, there's no reason why the methodology of the founding fathers articulated in the Federalist Papers couldn't have modified through time, looking at other factors and adjusting accordingly. They weren't committed to ignoring these factors out of hand. Now, it could be that their successors are, for maybe ideological reasons, but there's nothing intrinsic to the methodology they were using in order to create the U.S. Constitution, such that it was guilty of the same oversight as, say, the application of socialist principles in history?
I can certainly see the historical method that you're using to determine what happened. It would seem relatively uncontroversial to take general principles that we see in life around us inductively, that people don't tend to divulge information which make themselves look bad, etc., etc. And so if you do find some historical sources where someone from one side says, yeah, we really cocked that up, that was my fault, yeah, not great. It's like, well, okay, we have some high credence that such an event took place. So I wouldn't object to that, and that makes sense. The interesting thing, though, for me, though, is once we've established what happened, the difficulty, I think, with history is then asking the question why it happened. So, for instance, why was it the case that you had an economic meltdown of the Roman Empire? What were the factors that actually led to that? Mises, interestingly, makes the argument that actually it was price controls, or maximum prices after debasement of the currency to a large extent. Now, I don't know if he would dismiss any other explanations as well, but he says this one was major because the prices of the commodities were going up, and everyone was complaining about this because the bread price was going up. So then the emperor, I don't remember which one, then started putting maximum prices on to make sure, say, that the merchants couldn't sell bread for more than a certain price. Consequently, they couldn't make any money, and so you had a breakdown of sort of the division of labor, and people went back to the farm and to the rural areas. Now, that was sort of one of Mises's interpretations. But as I say, Mises' interpretation there is informed primarily by his economic theory, which is to a large extent or very theoretical. Now, Mises was a Kantian, basically. Rothbard does an interesting mention of Rothbard attempts really to put economics on broadly Aristotelian grounds, rather than a purely, in a sense, more of a purely theoretical one as Mises did, although their conclusions are basically this. They're not exactly the same, obviously, but they're very, very, very similar. So Mises would use this very rarefied, elaborate theoretical economic system to help him interpret history in parts. So the question is, to what extent is that right, or to what extent that's wrong? And I say, with the Federalist Papers, what methodology do you think was appropriate that they used, which made them able to look at these historical events and then draw the commonalities between them? Because you could probably draw various different commonalities which were kind of irrelevant. So I don't know. You could say that they all wore clothes. It's like, well, oh, okay, we should wear clothes. Oh, I suppose you could do that. But the question is, how do we determine which commonalities between, say, the classical political systems are the relevant ones to sort of group together? Why not group something else together? Again, it's sort of Mises' point when you're going out to do sort of economic history. It's like, which data do you go to collect, and why do you collect it? How would you? Could you give us a sketch of the kind of way you would attempt to do that?
Yeah, well, I actually think, okay, this is actually before the Federalist Papers, okay, but I think this is an illustrative example of what you're trying to ask. So let's say a good example that I can think of is the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote in his History of the Ancient World, his book on Philip II. So when Philip II is of Macedonia, seeking to reform the Macedonian army to such that it can be a world-winning force, He reads a section from the Iliad when the Trojans are besieging the ships, and the Greeks organize themselves in a defensive formation, which he interprets as a phalanx formation, which he then uses as inspiration, according to Siculus, to create his new Macedonian army. So what's the limiting factor he's looking for? Philip is asking himself a question. Well, I want to produce a world-winning army that can defeat my enemies. And then he's like, okay, well, let's look at how other people who were trying to solve the same problem I'm trying to solved it. And for example, his particular reading of the Iliad at that point is determined by his practical need. Philip is trying to determine how he can organize his forces effectively. And so you could argue that's somewhat praxeological, and maybe you could be correct about that. But that's how Philip is, in that particular case, limiting that factor. And so let's look at the Federalist Papers. If we look at one of the objectives that they wanted to achieve was to prevent the rise of a sort of, it's anachronistic to call it Bonapartism because Bonaparte hadn't taken power yet, but they wanted to prevent Bonapartism, right? You don't want a Julius Caesar taking over the Republic. You don't want a dictator or a demagogue taking over the Republic. And so that's one question they were trying to answer. So looking at the classical sources, what would be the limiting factor is, well, okay, what were the conditions that pertained when demagogues took power? We should probably, one, avoid those conditions developing within our country, because those seem to be the conditions that are associated with the rise of a demagogue, whether that's in ancient Rome with Caesar or the various Greek city-states. Aristotle in his Politics goes through a whole laundry list of revolutions that occur when a demagogue takes over. And then second of all, there are those city-states that have avoided demagogues, or even the early republic that avoided a demagogue and a tyrant. So then the question is, well, what were the state of conditions that persisted then? And then they'd be like, okay, so we know the state of conditions that persisted when these bad things happen that we don't like. And we know, as much as we can know from ancient history, the state of conditions of things when governments in the classical Mediterranean were more or less aligned with our own thinking. And so then the third limiting factor would be, well, how did they then decline from from one state to the other state? And taking a look at that, for example, with the Romans, you could say that the destruction of the yeomanry, where all the men were away fighting on the campaigns, allowed the patricians to buy up land on the cheap. All the slaves they captured were used to then work the estates, and these men had no property and then became armies for rent, which the demagogues used to enrich themselves. So one interpretation from that is the founding fathers argued that, well, we want to have a landed population, because if we have these sort of rent-seeking soldiers, then it's going to lead to the sort of melee and catastrophe of the late Roman Republic. And so I guess in a nutshell, the limiting factors are the questions that these people are asking and trying to find an answer to.
So would you say then the approach that you think history helps with is, rather than attempting to create a generalized theory, there are specific questions which you are attempting to solve, and then trying to figure out how historically that seems to have been to be solved, and then attempting to then look at all these things that we like, as it were, from history, and try to replicate them and try to avoid the things that we don't like. And then from there, you would then attempt to sort of, would you think it appropriate then to sort of try to generate a more general theory out of that, or would you avoid a sort of a general theorizing from there?
Well, no, I think that's generally accurate, and I do think some theory could be then deduced from that. I think one thing that maybe needs to be stated now, because I don't think I made it clear earlier, is that what I'm advocating is not for something that purports to be as precise and deductively correct as, say, something that socialist theorists or libertarian theorists would advocate. I'm advocating for something of lower precision and lower resolution, in the sense that for any given particular data point, you're not going to have 100% certainty in the same way that you would from a deductively inferred axiom. But what I am saying, though, is even though it's for each individual data point, maybe lower resolution, lower certainty, we do have what I would argue observable trends of a more. Let me use this example. Okay, I would say that my model is like a low risk investment that'll give you steady payment throughout a lifetime. Whereas I think that the results of applying these radically disembodied theories of a priori nature are like high risk loans that may or may not pay out, and if they don't pay out, it's a complete catastrophe for the investor. And so, if you look at the telescope time out long enough, weathering the storm of contingency, institutions that are based on a methodology like this tend to be much more robust, if not anti-fragile, than institutions that are based on pure theory. So again, for example, let's look at the French Revolution, and I've even heard libertarians say this in addition to conservatives, is that they have a theory that is completely opposed to human nature. But the theory of the French Revolution is an a priori theory, which, of course, that's the very question of human nature itself. What is human nature for the French revolutionaries and the Bolsheviks is determined in the same way it is for libertarians, through an a priori theory. So then to say that, well, their theory doesn't account for human nature is sort of begging the question, because it's just as much saying their theory is not my theory. Well, of course it's not your theory. That's why you're not a Jacobin. But the nature of the question of being consistent with human nature itself is the precondition for developing a theory like that.
I suppose the way one could respond to that is you could, in a sense, have an a priori theory of human nature, but then that would beg the question whether or not that's even possible. But just to step back a little, so going back to how the conditions which are likely to pertain prior to a revolution, my broad understanding is at least one of them seems to be that the population is very poor, but not just very poor. It's that they have been getting slightly richer, but they're still very poor, and then they rebel afterwards because they see that they're sort of oppressed, as it were, and there could be so much better living standards for the general population than there is under the present regime, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I would agree.
That's accurate. Yeah, I thought that was generally the case. So the question in my mind then is, how do you? What I'm thinking here is you need a theory. No, you haven't objected to this, but again, what are the principles? So, what are the principles that you can deduce as to why people would act in that way? I suppose the way I would look at that, a potential interpretation of that, would be to say, well, if people don't have any hope at all, they won't do anything. That there will be no point rebelling because there is absolutely no hope. So you need the sort of spur of things getting slightly better for people to sort of project to the future that so a better future day is possible. Is that the type of? So, because one thing is, without this type of reasoning, there is no way we can actually draw any general conclusions from the conditions that exist prior to revolutions, because you would seem to have to go through a stage of you could argue is psychology to some extent, which is, well, how can we explain why these conditions seem to generate it? And you'd have to sort of send it through a filter like that. Would you agree with that? And as a general interpretation, or would you approach it slightly differently?
Okay, so if you're going to say why would somebody, so yeah, let's go back to the example of a revolutionary situation. If the people were totally hopeless, then yeah, I would agree they probably wouldn't do anything. And there has to be at least the belief that action will make something better. It may not, but they have to believe that it will, otherwise they wouldn't do it. And so if we were to look at a revolutionary situation like that, but the other thing you could say too, though, is the people who are poor in the situation might choose not to rebel for, say, the reason that maybe they have an ancestral enemy that would take advantage of the dislocation and conquer them, which would be, better the devil we know than the devil we don't, right? Or maybe some of them are in some sense loyalists to the regime due to earlier historical contingent factors, and they think that this would be an act of sacrilege, like, right, maybe you're raising your hand against the duly anointed king, or maybe you're raising your hand against, they just won't ever do that because that would be considered tantamount to sacrilege. But when it comes to so the theory in limiting the scope of the interpretation, so again, I think part of what limits the scope is the kind of question you're asking. Now, that's not necessarily a theoretical question, because what's causing you to ask a particular question in a given time is in some sense contingent upon your events. But the nature of the question you're asking is going to, of course, limit the scope and the nature of your analysis. Because if you're asking a question, how do we avoid a revolutionary situation, say something that relates to increasing overall fertility, which might be an important question in another context, isn't necessarily important in this context. And so that factor, unless it can be somehow explained in terms of shedding light on this particular question, would go overlooked. But I think, again, it's not so much that theory doesn't have a place. I don't want to be like caught in between, say, pure theory or pure empiricism, as if the two are opposed or they can't work together. What I tend to see is a problem is that amongst libertarians in the far left, a pure theoretical understanding tends to either outright reject any sort of historical information or underplay accounts that don't fit their narrative, right? Because ultimately it's the question of what is the underlying nature of reality itself, right? If you consistently deny, okay, let me rephrase it. I think it's being a little clunky. Would you agree that there are other ways to learn things besides a priori inferences?
I would say we can take sense data from and see and have sort of a direct sort of realist understanding of the world, and then from this we can then generate theories and principles to further investigate reality. So I think an interesting comparison here could be mathematics. I wouldn't take the position of, say, innate ideas when it comes to sort of mathematics. They're sort of somehow within us, and we sort of discover them internally, as it were. Rather, we observe reality and we see that there are different things. And then we can say, well, this is not that thing. And so, or this is an orange, this is also an orange. So we can say, well, this is an orange and another orange. And so we have two oranges because we can aggregate homogeneous items. Now, obviously, it that presupposes that things are relevantly homogeneous to be able to add them. And from there, we can then develop a very elaborate theory of mathematics, which actually does, although mathematics is a way to explain reality is kind of slightly different insofar as whether it, to what extent it does actually explain reality, or whether it's, well, it does seem to be very useful, let's put it that way, when you can do it. So I don't have any objection to starting, as it were, with reality as such. Epistemologically, I think Etienne Gilson is quite interesting in this regard as a Thomistic philosopher from the early 20th century. But I think our major difference is how elaborate our theory can be. So I was, before you asked this question, going to say about economics. I think I can put Misesian praxeology on empirical grounds to an extent. What do I mean? What we can do is, one of the major problems in classical economics is the diamond-water paradox. Water is significantly more useful than diamonds, yet diamonds has a higher value. Now, how can we, a monetary value? How can we explain this? Well, what we have to explain it by is, well, you could do the labor theory of value, that cost determines price, but then that doesn't explain why anyone would dig the diamonds out to begin with. So we have to have, as it were, a demand-side interpretation. People actually want diamonds. Okay, so who wants it? And do groups want it, or only individuals want it? And we can sort of abstract from there to figure out, well, the value of diamonds is basically dependent upon individuals' subjective valuations of those diamonds. And then the question is, well, why do they have such valuations? Well, because they're in a world of scarcity, an empirical postulate, which they are then attempting to use means to achieve their own goals. And you can go from there, and obviously to explain the diamond-water paradox, you invoke diminishing marginal utility. Because the first unit of a homogeneous good you'd use for the most valued end that you could, and so the second unit you would use for the less valued one. And so I think you can base sort of economic praxeological theory on sort of the more empirical ground, in similar to the way I view mathematics. But then I think, similarly with mathematics, you can then develop a somewhat elaborate theoretical position, which you can then use to interpret the world. So that would be sort of my position, which I think is somewhat different to yours, although not entirely different.
I think that as much as a limitation of historical knowledge, this is a limitation of how much a theory can explain. Because I would freely admit that history isn't as precise as mathematics or even the natural sciences, because unlike mathematics, I don't think you can do it a priori. Unlike the natural sciences, you don't really have tests and control. But what you do have is patterns that arise throughout history. And I think what I would argue is that a historian who's doing his job is going to start seeing these patterns. And when you see these patterns, you can then start to see a larger whole from them. And now, of course, the fewer data points you have from the historical record, the less likely you are to see certain patterns. And you're less likely to see certain patterns if you a priori reject certain data points as just being non-truths. Maybe, for example, from the point of view of the USSR, you're going to look at things through this very radically reductionist, materialist narrative. So anything that doesn't conform to radical materialism, maybe let's say people that have religious motivations or ethical or moral motivations that are not, strictly speaking, reducible to material factors, you can't account for that under the Soviet model because it's just materialist dialectic. And so there's aspects of the human person and human experience that they can't account for. So in a sense, you get blindsided by events as they unfold. People are being motivated and acting on principles that you claim either don't exist or don't need to be taken into account. But by failing to do that, you leave yourself completely open to being swept away by current events, for example, as we saw with the collapse of the USSR. And also, sort of the high watermark of libertarian theory, like in the mid 1990s, when they could say, "See, we told you so about the USSR." It's not so much what it explains that's the problem; it's what it doesn't. Because if we think of an empirical science where it fails to explain something, that doesn't necessarily invalidate the scientific theoretical model necessarily. It might if there's enough factors that are observed that it can't explain, and then you have a paradigm shift. But with an a priori theory, we're not basing the explanatory power based on current knowledge of external affairs. We're basing it on knowledge of mental truths. And so when you do explain something, well, that's great. It means, it but when it can't explain something, like why didn't that process continue? Why didn't the process of privatization continue such to the point that the whole world doesn't have states at all and that all security is private? It seems to me, if anything, that the trend of fission that was taking place in the USSR is in some sense reversed, with the sort of more authoritarian state of Xi Jinping in China and certain disquieting trends in the West. Now, again, the sort of because the a priori libertarian theorists hitched themselves to a certain reading of history as it was unfolding in their lifetimes, it gave them a real boost when history was moving in that direction. But now that history seems to be moving in another direction, it then becomes difficult to explain how they couldn't have explained it.
The question there, though, I think is the question of how do we modify the theory? Do we say that the empirical is it the case that the events post the fall of the Soviet Union, do they per se invalidate the theory, or is it the case that the empirical events give us cause to potentially revise the theory, and then find spots within the theory, within the sort of the system, which actually were in fact false, but we didn't realize they were false until we carefully looked over the assumptions and the descriptions of the system. So, for example, go.
Yeah, I was just going to say, from a point of view of, okay, maybe this is just the problem of imprecise language. But one of the things that I find problematic, at least with the second possibility, is that those are the kinds of questions that one would ask of a empirical scientific theory. So when we think of like a priori reasoning, one of the areas in which I'm familiar with that a lot is the apologetics debate that's been going on for like the last 20 years now. And when you listen to, say, people like William Lane Craig or Alvin Plantinga and others who make an a priori argument for the existence of God, it's a wholly qualitative different way of thinking about the problem. It's not like saying, but the kind of arguments that they make about the existence of God are not the kinds of arguments that could in principle be falsified by observable data. They're just a different kind of argument entirely that stands independent from that. And what I'm saying is, if you are making claims that could theoretically or actually be falsified by empirical observation, then you're not actually making an a priori theory in the first place.
You would approach that slightly differently. I suppose the way I would take it is not whether the theory was wrong, but rather whether the theory applied or not. And that might, and then the question is whether we sufficiently circumscribe what the theory should actually say. So let me take an economics example again. So one might say that an increase in the minimum wage will cause unemployment, for example. That would be a most basic claim. But that isn't really the claim. The claim is that no firm, if it's a profit maximizing firm, will pay a worker more than he generates in revenue for the firm. And so if you require the employer to pay more than that, then he won't employ him at all. That is basically what the theoretical claim is, if you articulate it precisely. And I suppose if you were to do this more precisely again, you would also say that somehow the workers' productivity doesn't just go up just because the government mandated a minimum wage. You could claim, oh, well, the individual theoretically could be motivated by the great glorious leader bestowing upon him a greater minimum wage, and therefore he works harder, and so he generates more revenue for the firm, and therefore doesn't become unemployed because of the minimum wage, because in fact his productivity increased. And there's also the fact, the assumption that firms will actually follow the law. That's another one, because if they don't follow the law, then it won't cause anything to take place because they'll just do it illegally. I think I covered all the possible bases of the argument on the minimum wage as precisely as I can. Now, I could have missed something. So I would claim that if it was the case that the minimum wage did appear to increase employment, or at least not reduce it once it was increased, one of those situations which I don't think is likely to take place did in fact take place. But that wouldn't invalidate the theory as I just generated it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was only going to say that unfortunately we're nearing the end of the hour. We could theoretically do a follow-up episode. But I guess what I would say for concluding remarks is that I think what we have gotten to is that I take a more or less bottom-up approach that doesn't exclude theory per se, and you take a more or less top-down approach that doesn't discount observation per se. But then trying to figure out where they meet and diverge is still, I don't think, been done yet.
I would, as a concluding remark, just try and restate my position. I think I attempt a bottom-up position in a certain way, as I try to illustrate with my approach to economics and praxeology. I am just much more comfortable in creating generalizable theories based on the observation in quite an elaborate fashion, and then using this then to interpret the data in reality, and then of course history. So back to sort of East and West Germany, that I could explain the relative wealth differences to a large extent based on that theoretical model, and could avoid the problems that, say, Richard Wolff attempted to use Dave Freeman. Freeman probably would as well if he'd responded, but he hadn't. So I may be top down, but I don't think I am. It's just that I am much happier creating generalizable theories from relatively small empirical truths than I think you are. I think that's the major difference.
That might be, but at this point, though, I think we do need to wrap up. And again, thanks again, Swithun. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.